The surgeon. She was lying on her back on cold stone, and she was bleeding, and she had 3 patients she was keeping alive, and the one on the radio did not know she was the one keeping him calm. The round that had found her left side had gone through cleanly. She had established that in the first 4 seconds after she went down. Not the aorta, not the spleen. A diagonal path through soft tissue that would require attention she did not currently have time to give it. She had catalogued it and set it aside in the part of her mind reserved for things that were real and serious and not yet urgent. The tourniquet on her left thigh from the vehicle fragment was cinched to the 3rd click. She had placed it with one hand while the other worked Reyes's chest. She had done it without looking down. This was not a skill that could be taught in a classroom. It was a skill that required the kind of repetition that transforms instruction into reflex and reflex into something that no longer requires being thought about at all. Reyes was in V-fib. She had shocked him twice. The 3rd time would require a different approach because the field defibrillator had taken a round in the housing and the display was reading numbers that no longer corresponded to anything useful. She knew what the numbers should be. She knew what the sound of his chest was telling her that the display was not. She worked from the sound. She had been working from sound and touch, and the information her hands gathered before her eyes did for most of her adult life. Her hands knew things she could not always explain. She did not need to explain them. Ren's voice came through the earpiece flat and controlled. Tango Northeast, upper window, using the corner as a rest. He has a clean line to Harlow's position if Harlow moves 6 feet left. She was already working. Tell Harlow not to move 6 feet left. A pause that carried more than its duration. Harlow already moved. Then get Torres into an elevated position northeast of the vehicle and tell him to wait for the wind to settle. Silence. Then, Torres is down. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The same 2 seconds she had given herself in every situation since the first time she had learned that 2 seconds of stillness was the difference between responding and reacting, and that responding was the only useful category. Then she opened them and went back to Reyes's chest and counted his breaths, and did not think about the road that had brought her to this particular floor on this particular night. 23 hours earlier, she had walked into a room full of people who expected nothing from her. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. She was always prepared for it. The preparation had not made it easier. It had made it manageable. There was a difference. The Joint Special Operations Task Force compound sat in a geography that appeared on no civilian navigation system and was referred to in official documents by a letter number designation that told nothing to anyone who had not been briefed. The air had the quality of elevation and dry heat that changed nothing about the work, but changed how the body registered the work. Building 9 held the team room. Building 7 held operations. Building 4 held temporary personnel. Maya Chen had been given a room in Building 4, a badge, and a briefing folder. She had arrived 40 minutes before the scheduled briefing, read the access document twice, mapped the corridor layout, and set her trauma kit down beside the bunk with the economy of someone for whom this sequence of actions had been performed enough times that it required no conscious allocation of attention. She was 29 years old. She had been offered this assignment 4 times in the preceding 7 months. She had accepted it on the 5th offer because the 5th offer had come through a channel that told her something about what the operation actually was, and when she understood what it actually was, she understood why she needed to be on it. She carried 3 things in the inside pocket of every jacket she owned. The first was a photograph, printed under field conditions 26 months ago, its edges softened from daily contact. The second was an envelope, the handwriting on the front deliberate and clear, the seal broken and resecured with medical tape. The third was a folded piece of paper containing 6 numbers that formed a coordinate that she had not yet been able to act on. She had been patient. She had learned patience from a man who had taught her everything else, and she had learned it the same way. Not as a virtue, but as a tool. The patient person does not wait. The patient person prepares. Building 9 held 11 men when she walked in. The room was built for 20 and held the particular smell of a place that had been occupied continuously by people doing difficult physical and mental work for years. Sweat and metal, and the specific staleness of recycled air that has been breathed by people who did not have time to notice it. Maps on 2 walls. Equipment staged along the 3rd. The 4th wall held a display screen running terrain elevation data for a mountain range that would not appear by name in anything she was authorized to read. Coffee sat on a burner. It had been there since before dawn. Maya set her bag down at the single empty chair, end of the table, near the door, in the position she would have chosen even if she had been given the option, and sat with her hands folded on the surface in front of her and looked at the topographic spread. She had been reading terrain since she was 12 years old. Her father had taught her. He had taught her the way he taught everything, with the patience of someone who believed that knowledge had value independent of whether it would ever be needed, and with the quiet conviction that the best preparation looks like excess until the moment when it does not look like anything except the only thing that could have helped. None of the 11 men looked up when she came in. Then 2 of them did. Then all of them did, in the way that happens when something has entered a calculation that was not included in the original inputs. The room did not change visibly. Something moved through it nonetheless. She was 5 feet 3 inches tall. She weighed 116 pounds. She wore a standard-issue Navy medical uniform that was slightly too large in the shoulders, and she did not draw attention to this. Her hair was dark and pulled back without ceremony. Her eyes moved around the room once, not nervously, not performing confidence, but in the way a person looks at a new space when they are trying to understand its specific geometry and its specific vulnerabilities. Lieutenant Commander Bates sat at the head of the table. He was 41 years old, 16 years in naval special warfare, and carried himself with the particular economy of a man who had spent those years organizing the world around his requirements rather than organizing himself around the world. He had the stillness of absolute certainty. He had the face of someone who had been making irreversible decisions for so long that irreversibility had become comfortable. He did not look up from the map in front of him. He let the silence extend 4 seconds past where it needed to be. Then, without raising his eyes, "Operations said they were sending us a surgeon." "They did, sir." "You're it." "Yes, sir." He looked up. He looked at her for 3 seconds, with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion before the evidence has been fully presented, a form of error that costs the most in the contexts where error is most expensive. He looked back at the map. "Get the mission package from Wren, your rear element medical. Stay there until directed otherwise." Chief Petty Officer Wren was sitting against the eastern wall, appearing to review a tablet. He had been appearing to review a tablet since before she arrived. He had the particular quality of attention that looks like its absence, an absence of visible engagement that was in fact its precise opposite. He was 43 years old and had the face of someone who had spent those years outside in difficult conditions and had reached an accommodation with those conditions that was not peace exactly, but was something past conflict. He nodded once at Maya and passed her a folder without speaking. He did not attempt eye contact. He did not need to. Petty Officer First Class Harlow occupied the seat nearest the equipment staging area. He was 6 feet 2, 230 pounds, and had the physical presence of someone who had spent considerable time and effort constructing that presence as a form of professional statement. He leaned 3 inches toward the man beside him when Maya sat down. The look on his face said everything that he had decided was better left unofficial. He said, at a volume calibrated to be audible without constituting a formal statement. "She going to run with us or ride in the vehicle?" The room did not respond with words, which was its own form of response. Maya looked at the topographic spread on the wall. The target area was a valley system with two converging ridgelines, a natural depression at the head, a single structure at the end of a logging track that had not been maintained in years. The kind of terrain where elevation advantage determined outcomes before contact was established. She had been reading terrain like this for 17 years. She read it the way a person reads a language they learned before they were old enough to remember learning it. She said nothing and opened the folder. The mission was designated Cobalt Ridge. The objective was a man named Aldridge, a Defense Intelligence Agency case officer who had been compromised 72 hours earlier and was now stationary at a location 14 kilometers northeast of their current position. The compromise had occurred during a scheduled exchange with a foreign national who had turned. Aldridge had been carrying a physical file, assembled over 4 years, not digital, the product of the kind of patience that generates either deep admiration or deep fear, and that file contained the identities of 31 human intelligence sources across 6 countries. The exchange was scheduled to complete in 34 hours. The DIA had a window. Task Force Bravo was the window. Bates laid it out in 12 minutes. Questions came about terrain, hostile numbers, extraction routes, communication windows, rules of engagement for a civilian tier intelligence officer operating in a contested environment. Nobody asked about Maya Chen, not directly, but when Bates assigned her position, forward medical, moving with the primary element, the pause that followed was not without content. Harlow's jaw tightened. A man named Koch cleared his throat. Maya wrote her assignment in the notebook she carried and said, "Yes, sir." She offered nothing more. The first indication came 40 minutes later. Pre-mission medical evaluation was standard protocol. The team's primary SARC, Petty Officer Second Class Ferris, was running through the checklist in the adjacent bay. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen saturation, injury disclosures. He moved through the line with the efficient neutrality of someone performing a task they have performed enough times that it has become administrative rather than clinical. He reached each man, took his readings, noted his responses, moved on. Maya had been standing near the door waiting her turn, watching Petty Officer First Class Koch for the preceding 35 minutes in the way she watched everything, without appearing to, with the quiet comprehensive attention of someone who has learned that what people do not show is as informative as what they show. Koch was 14 years in the teams. He was 6 feet even, 200 pounds, built with the specific efficiency of someone who had never carried excess weight. He moved well. He moved almost perfectly. The asymmetry was in his right shoulder, visible under load. A lag of approximately 150 milliseconds on the right side when he raised his arm above shoulder height. She had watched him lift and set down his rifle pack twice during equipment staging. The lag was consistent. In a man with 14 years of muscle memory and practiced perfect form, that kind of consistent lag was not fatigue. It was structural. When Ferris reached her, she stepped forward, took her readings, normal across the board, was initialed and cleared. She did not move from the bay. "Koch," she said. He looked at her from across the room. His expression was the controlled neutral of someone who has spent 14 years not expressing most of what he was thinking. "When did you hyperextend the right shoulder?" "I didn't." "When did you injure it?" A pause that said he had been waiting for someone to ask this. 4 days ago, vehicle rollover, I was cleared." "Cleared for what, specifically?" "Soft tissue, nothing structural." "Who cleared you?" "Battalion surgeon." "Take a deep breath for me." He breathed. She listened. She listened the way a person listens when a sound is a language they have spent years acquiring, and she heard what Ferris had not heard because Ferris had not listened long enough or had not known precisely what to listen for. The right lung had a specific quality of restricted expansion at the upper lobe, subtle at rest. Under sustained physical exertion at the elevation they were going to, under the thermal stress of a cold mountain night, carrying a ruck with contact probable, that restriction would announce itself in a way that could not be managed in the field. "You have a partial posterior rotator cuff tear," she said. "The vehicle impact compressed the joint at an angle the initial assessment didn't capture because the acute inflammation had already partially resolved by the time you were seen." She was already moving, opening her kit, hands finding what they needed with the specific, unhurried speed of someone for whom this layout was not a system, memorized from a manual, but a language spoken fluently. Under sustained load at elevation tonight, you will lose 30 to 40% of functional strength in that arm. You will lose accuracy on the rifle, and the pain will be significant past the second hour. Koch said nothing. The bay was quiet. "I can tape it for support function," she said. "You stay in a support role. You do not primary element climb with a full ruck. Those are my two conditions for clearing you." "She's calling the whole team's fitness now?" Harlow said from across the bay. Not shouting. The specific low-controlled register of a man who wants his objection recorded without making it a formal confrontation. "Ferris already cleared him." "Ferris cleared the acute injury," Maya said. She had not looked at Harlow. "I'm assessing residual risk for the specific physical parameters of this mission." Bates had appeared in the doorway. He stood there for 30 seconds without speaking. He watched the economy of Maya's hands, the absence of wasted motion, the way she found each instrument without looking down for it, the way Koch's expression had shifted, not from doubt to belief, but from waiting to having received something he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. "What is your functional recommendation?" Bates said. "Support element, not primary. He can carry but not climb under full load. Reduces his effectiveness in the approach phase by approximately 40%. Bates looked at Koch for 2 seconds. Koch gave him nothing in return. "Adjust the roster," Bates said to Wren. He walked out. What he did not see as he left was the quality of stillness with which Maya watched the door close. Not satisfaction, not vindication. The patient steadiness of someone who has performed a task that needed performing and whose attention has already moved to the next task. Wren was in the corner. He had been sitting there since the evaluation began, appearing to review his tablet. He reached for the small notepad in his breast pocket. He wrote one word. He folded the paper and set it flat on the equipment case beside him. He went back to his tablet, and his face did not change. The equipment staging bay held every item the team was taking into the valley. Maya was conducting her own inventory at the secondary table. Among the staged equipment was a Barrett MRAD in its case, its presence on the table occupying a specific quality of space that precision instruments occupy, the quiet authority of something built to a single purpose with complete fidelity to that purpose. Harlow was checking the suppressor mount on his primary rifle 6 feet away. He set his rifle down and reached across the table for a torque tool, and his forearm contacted the edge of the MRAD case, which shifted 4 inches toward Maya's clipboard. Her right hand came up and stopped it. That was ordinary. What happened after was not. It lasted less than a second, the fraction of time that lives below conscious thought in the part of the nervous system that has been trained and trained and trained again until training has become reflex, and reflex has become something that operates without authorization. Her thumb moved 3 inches. It found the cant of the case handle and settled there in the exact orientation of someone who had been managing this specific class of instrument, or one closely related to it, for a very long time. The weight of it registered in her grip with the specific quality of something familiar. Then, her hand lifted away, and she went back to her inventory sheet. Harlow had not been looking. Wren had. He was 8 feet away, and he had the gift, or the discipline, it was difficult to distinguish which, after enough years, of appearing to see nothing while seeing everything. He reached for his notepad. He wrote one word beneath the first. He folded the paper in half and put it in his breast pocket and did not think about it again until he needed to. The moment that mattered came at 17:20, 15 minutes before deployment. Bates was walking through the execution phase of the mission brief. Routes, contingencies, communication windows, medical protocols. He reached the precision fire element and went through the primary and alternate assignments, and then said, "If Torres is unavailable for any reason, who else on this team is qualified on the MRAD at engagement distance for the Valley profile tonight?" The Valley wind profile had been on the briefing display for 20 minutes. The ridgeline distances were on the terrain map. 3 men indicated partial qualification. Bates assessed each one and marked them as contingency with specific noted limitations. Nobody else volunteered. In the corridor outside the briefing room, Wren was waiting for her. He held the folded piece of paper out without introduction. Maya looked at it. She did not take it. He set it on top of her kit and walked away. She opened it later, in the transport vehicle, in the dark, while the terrain outside the window assembled itself into the shapes the briefing maps had predicted. 2 words, written in Wren's careful hand. She folded the paper and put it in her inside pocket and looked at the ridgelines and said nothing for the rest of the drive. The valley was everything the briefing had described and several things it had not. The insertion point was a dry creek bed 2 kilometers from the target structure, in a draw that created cover from the north ridge. Cold night, cloud cover intermittent, the stars appearing and disappearing in the gaps between ridges with the indifference of things that have no stake in what happens below them. The team moved without light, each person in their assigned position, spacing correct, pace measured. Maya was at the rear left of the primary element, trauma kit on her back, rifle slung, breathing controlled. She had been moving in conditions like this since before she had been eligible to vote. The terrain read the way her father had taught her to read it, not as a landscape but as a system with its own logic, every elevation and drainage and sightline a variable with a calculable value if you understood what you were calculating for. The target structure was a stone farmhouse at the head of the valley. Aldridge's last confirmed contact had been 16 hours earlier. His health status was unknown. The DIA assessment was that the compromised case officer had likely experienced trauma, because people whose covers are broken do not typically remain physically intact for long, once the people who broke their cover understand what they have. The final 200 meters were covered in a loose file, Bates leading, Wren flanking, Torres carrying the MRAD in its field case. Harlow and 3 others distributed across the approach in the fluid choreography of people who have rehearsed this specific sequence enough times that rehearsal and execution have become the same thing. Maya at the rear. She was 40 meters from the structure when the first shot came. It came from elevation. She knew this from the angle of the impact. The round hit the stone wall 6 inches from Harlow's position at a downward trajectory that established the shooter was above them and to the northwest. The second shot hit the ground between Wren and Torres. The third shot, Torres went down. Not from the shot. From the cover movement, from the dark terrain, from the specific bad geometry of a 200-pound man throwing himself flat in unfamiliar terrain at night. His ankle found a crevice in the rock, and the MRAD hit the ground 3 feet from him. Case open, the rifle available, Torres not. Contact Northwest Ridge, Bates said through the earpiece. His voice had the specific quality of a command voice that has been stripped of everything except information. Elevated position. Everyone find cover and hold. The team moved, not in chaos, in the disciplined dispersal of people who have practiced for this exact sequence and whose practice has become involuntary. Stone walls materialized as cover. A vehicle bermed against the slope, the angle of the structure itself. Maya pressed herself behind a rock formation, trauma kit between her knees, and looked northwest. The ridge rose 260 meters above the valley floor. At the crest, a natural rock formation, an overhang that provided cover from above and from the shooter's right, while leaving a narrow horizontal window to his left. She could see the barrel. She could see the profile of the position. She measured the distance the way her father had taught her to measure distances, with her eyes, from specific reference points, using the method he had taught her in an empty field, with a surveyor's tape and the patience of a man who believed that measurement was a form of respect for the world. 940 meters, possibly 960, uphill angle of approximately 17 degrees. The MRAD was 3 feet from Torres, in the open ground between the rock formation and the structure wall. Wren's voice. He has elevation advantage over the entire depression. We cannot suppress from current positions. Harlow. I cannot get an angle from the west. Bates. Torres. Ankle is gone. I cannot get into position. I cannot take the shot from here. A pause. The geometry of the problem assembling itself in every mind on the net simultaneously. The MRAD on the ground. The shooter above them with patience and angle. The window closing. Anyone else qualified on the MRAD at this range and this wind profile? Bates said. The silence was not the absence of answers. It was the presence of people doing honest calculations and finding their honest answers insufficient for the specific problem. Maya looked at the MRAD. She looked at the distance. She was moving before she had finished the thought, low and fast across the exposed ground in the way she had moved in every environment where moving low and fast was the specific requirement, which was more environments than anyone on this net knew about. She reached the MRAD in 6 seconds. She was going flat as her hands found it, belly on cold stone, the weapon coming into position with the unhurried economy of muscle memory that does not hurry because it does not need to hurry. Speed and hurrying are not the same thing. Her father had told her this when she was 14 years old. Negative. Harlow's voice through the earpiece had a quality it had not had 23 hours ago. Negative, she cannot. She had the bipod legs down. She found the scope. The northwest ridge resolved in the glass with the clarity that cold, dry air and a clean night produce when you are looking through good glass at a distance you have already correctly estimated. Harlow. Bates's voice closed the conversation. She found the rock formation. She found the overhang profile. She found the barrel, extended past the rock at the specific angle that told her the shooter was right-handed, body-oriented northeast, which created a specific gap in his peripheral coverage to the south. She found the shape of the man behind the rifle, the outline of his position, the specific things his body posture told her about his training and his confidence and his intention. 940 meters. Valley wind from the west-southwest, approximately 11 miles per hour at the ridgeline. The valley terrain would channel it, create a secondary cross-component in the depression that would not match the elevated wind. Temperature 4 degrees Celsius. Uphill angle reducing bullet drop by approximately 42%. Her father's voice, unchanged by years and distance. You are not trying to hit the target. You are trying to understand the conditions completely and then let the physics do the work. The shooter is the last variable. Everything else must already be solved. She breathed in through her nose. Slow. The kind of breath that asks the body to settle rather than ordering it to settle, because in 17 years she had learned that commanding the body under this level of demand produced a specific category of error that asking did not. The body cooperates with asking. It resists commanding. She adjusted the scope turrets. 4 adjustments. She had not fired this specific rifle in 47 months. The mathematics had not changed. The physics had not changed. Her understanding of both had only deepened. Through the earpiece, Ren. He is repositioning, moving to close his angle on the south flank. 3 seconds of stillness. The shooter settling into the new position. The brief moment between adjustment and re-engagement when every element reaches its new equilibrium simultaneously. She squeezed. The Barrett MRAD in .338 Lapua Magnum does not produce the recoil most people imagine. It produces a physical event, a momentum transfer that moves through the shooter in a direction and at a magnitude that requires the shooter to have already arranged themselves to receive it, not to resist it, but to distribute it across a frame that has been prepared through enough repetition that the preparation is no longer something the shooter thinks about. Maya had arranged herself. She had been arranging herself for this kind of event since the first time her father put a precision rifle in her hands and said, "Don't fight it. Receive it. The fight is already over. You already did the work. All that's left is to receive what you prepared for." She received it. The shot landed 4 inches right of center. She noted this without frustration, without anything except data. The Valley Cross component had carried a secondary variance she had slightly underweighted, the specific interference pattern that occurs when a drainage cut crosses the primary wind channel. She had seen this before. She recalculated in 3 seconds. She cycled the bolt. She reacquired. The secondary variance was predictable now. She had its measure. She breathed. She waited. The second shot broke. 943 meters downrange, the shooter on the northwest ridge did not move again. The silence after a confirmed long-range engagement has a specific quality. It is not peace. It is the absence of the immediate thing that was requiring responses, which creates a temporary space that feels like stillness, but is not. It lasted 4 seconds. Bates' voice. The voice of a man performing the act of maintaining his command voice, while the operational picture he had held for 23 hours was reorganizing itself around a variable he had not included in any of his calculations. "Ren, confirm." "Ren, from the north flank. Target down. No movement. Northwest ridge is clear." A pause. "Chen, sit rep. Position secure," she said. She was already cycling up from the prone, pulling the bipod legs back, lifting the MRAD, carrying it toward Torres's position. Moving to Torres. Torres had a broken fibula from the fall. She had him stabilized in 4 minutes. Fibula splinted with materials from her kit that her hands found without her directing them to find them, because the layout of her trauma kit was not a memorized system, but a practiced language. She told him the injury assessment in the same tone she used for everything, accurate, specific, without inflection that served no function. He would not be walking out. She noted his status into the net and moved to Ren. Ren had a stone fragment in his left forearm from the wall debris near the second impact. She removed it with a tool smaller than a pen and closed the wound with 3 sutures, in a pattern that would leave a minimal scar. He watched her hands the entire time. He said nothing. When she finished, he said, "Thank you." 2 words. She had the specific sense that he said them rarely and chose when to say them. Harlow had a cut above his right eye from the same debris field. She cleaned it and closed it with 2 butterfly closures and said, "Lean your head forward." He leaned his head forward without the delay that had preceded every other instruction she had given him in the preceding 23 hours. She did not comment on this. The observation had no useful application. Aldridge was inside the structure. He was alive. He had treated himself with materials from a basic kit: gauze, tape, improvised pressure bandage, with the competence of a man who had spent 19 years in environments where improvisation was the primary available medical technology. The wound was to his left side. It had been made by something small and fast, the kind of wound that does exactly as much damage as it does, and no more, which in Aldridge's case was enough to make him careful about how he moved, but not enough to stop him. His color was poor. His hydration was inadequate. His eyes had the quality of someone who has been making extremely difficult decisions under continuous time pressure for 72 hours and has reached the point where the difficulty has become normalized. He looked at Maya when she came through the door. He looked at her hands as she opened her kit. He said, "DIA sent a trauma surgeon." "Navy," she said. She was already working. "How long since you changed the dressing?" 7 hours. "Any fever above 38.5? 38.1 when I last measured." "When did you last measure?" 4 hours ago." She worked. She told him what she was doing as she did it, not because he needed the reassurance, but because people in his condition maintained physiologically better when they understood the sequence. She had learned this from observation, from practice, from the accumulated evidence of years of doing this work in conditions that did not permit errors that a quieter environment would have forgiven. The aluminum case was against the wall, latched. She looked at it once and looked away. There would be time for the case when Aldridge was stable. He became stable in 22 minutes. Bates came through the door when the team had consolidated inside the structure. He stood for 10 seconds in the doorway, looking at Aldridge, and then at Maya, and then at Torres propped against the wall with his leg immobilized and his color returning toward normal. He stood there with the expression of a man who is processing the difference between what he expected and what is in front of him, and who has enough experience with that specific process to do it without the process showing too clearly. He walked to Ren. Ren handed him the folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. Bates opened it. He read the 2 words. He looked at Maya. She was repacking her trauma kit with the same economy that had governed every movement she had made since she walked into Building 9 the previous morning. She had not looked at him. He held out the paper. She did not take it. "I know what it says, sir." He held her gaze. 23 years of naval special warfare had taught him the capacity to look at people without flinching from what he found. He used that capacity now. He found something he had not expected, not competence, which he had anticipated in the abstract from a Navy surgeon, but the specific quality of competence that has been paid for in a specific currency that he recognized because he had spent his own career paying in it. He recognized the posture. He recognized the economy. He recognized the particular way her eyes moved in a room that was not the way a medical professional's eyes moved. "How long?" he said. She picked up her kit. "Long enough, sir." He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he looked at the window and the dark ridgeline outside it, and ran the distance calculation that his eyes had already told him the answer to, but that some part of his brain required numbers to accept. 940 meters, he said. 943. The second shot. His face went through something during those 3 seconds. The kind of controlled movement that happens when what a man is looking at is colliding with what he has believed for 23 hours, and the collision has consequences he is not finished calculating. He did not ask the question she could see forming in him. A man with his experience understood that some questions were better approached through channels that had been designed for them. "Get Aldridge ready for extraction," he said. "We have a window in 38 minutes. He walked toward the door. He paused in the doorway without turning. "Good work, Chen." The words had the specific weight of words chosen by someone who chooses them rarely, which gave them more weight than the same words from someone who used them freely. Then he was gone. Ren was still in the corner. He caught Maya's eye. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has known something for some time and is acknowledging that what he knew has now been confirmed. She went back to her kit. The extraction took 40 minutes. She spent 36 of them moving between patients, monitoring Aldridge's pressure, checking Torres's immobilization, and watching for compartment syndrome, reassessing Ren's arm, watching for the secondary presentations that trauma produces in the hour after the acute phase resolves. She had seen those presentations in environments where nobody was watching for them, and she had watched people survive the original injury and then not survive the thing that followed it, and she had learned from each instance in the way that the most permanent learning happens, not from being told, but from seeing. In the 4 remaining minutes, she sat against the stone wall and allowed herself to be still. The fragment in her left side had managed itself, as she had calculated it would. The pain was a 5. She noted it and set it aside. She reached into her inside jacket pocket. The envelope was there. It had been there every day for 3 years, in every jacket she had owned, through 3 countries, 2 extended deployments, and the hospital stay in Germany that she still did not fully account for in the general narrative she told people about that period. The corners had gone soft from handling. The handwriting on the front was her father's. Deliberate, clear, infrequent. A man who wrote with intention because he did not write often and understood that the occasion required it. Open when you need to remember why. She did not open it. She knew what it said. The words had long since moved from the category of things she needed to read to the category of things she simply knew, the way she knew her own heartbeat, not because she was thinking about it, but because it was present. She held the envelope in both hands and looked at the stone wall in front of her and let herself feel the weight of it for the specific 30 seconds that she permitted for this particular activity. Then she put it back and stood up and went back to work. The debriefing room smelled of recycled air and the specific fatigue that gathers in rooms where difficult things have been decided for years. Bates walked her through the sequence twice. She answered every question with the precision she brought to medical assessment, accurate, specific, without elaboration that had not been asked for. At the end of the second pass, he said, "Your records past 2021 are incomplete." "Yes, sir." "That kind of incompleteness is not administrative." "No, sir." He looked at her for a long time. He had read her file 4 times in the preceding 3 hours, each reading producing something the previous reading had not. "Your father," he said. "Master Chief David Chen," she said. "Navy SEAL, killed in action, 2014. Classified operation, body not recovered. File sealed under Special Access Program classification." He was still looking at her. "I was 20 years old," she said. "I had completed the SARC pipeline 14 months earlier. I was the first woman to complete it." She paused. "I was in the valley when it happened. I was the only one who came out." The room was very still. Bates looked at his hands on the table. He was the kind of man who spent his career not looking at his hands. The fact that he was doing it now was information. "You arranged the DIA request," he said, "the one that put you on this team. I needed a team with sufficient clearance to operate near Aldridge without triggering the agency protocols that would have compromised the approach. And I needed a commander whose name on a formal statement would carry the institutional weight that a former SARC with an expunged record cannot generate alone." She held his eyes. "That is not why I did what I did tonight. I did what I did tonight because it needed doing. Those 2 things are separate." He absorbed that. "You could have told me this before." She looked at him steadily. You called me a surgeon when you assigned me. You put me in the rear element without a conversation. You looked at me in that briefing room and made a calculation before I had said a word. She paused. Some people need the demonstration before they can hear the argument. That is not a criticism. It is an observation about how evidence works in the specific environment we both chose. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he said, "That is a more accurate description of my failures than I would have arrived at on my own." He looked at the table. "And it is probably more generous than they deserve." "It is accurate," she said. "You made assumptions based on insufficient data. Everyone in that room did. The assumptions were wrong. They were not malicious. There is a difference." She picked up her kit. "What I need from you is a formal statement. Everything you know about Operation Stonegate from 2014. Your chain of command, the authorization structure, what the file says and doesn't say. Not for me. For what happens next." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens next?" "My father is alive," she said. "He has been alive for 10 years, under a cover that was arranged without his consent by people who needed him to not exist. The file Aldridge was carrying has his name in it, which is why Aldridge was compromised 3 days ago, and which is why I am on this team, and which is why this conversation is happening at 0200 in a room that will not appear in any official record of the evening." She stood. "I am not asking you to find him. I already know where he is. I am asking you to create the documented record that makes it possible for him to come back without being a problem for the people who would prefer he stay missing." He looked at the envelope she had placed on the table. "Your statement makes him a public record," she said. "Public records are harder to make disappear than classified ones. That is the entire mechanism." She paused. "You signed a document once that made my father's life contingent on other people's preferences. I am asking you to sign one that takes that contingency away." The room held the specific silence of a man sitting at the edge of a decision about something he has been avoiding and finding that avoidance is no longer available. He looked up. "You'll have it," he said. "Everything I know, everything I authorized, and everything I was told I was authorizing, and everything I should have asked about and didn't. Everything." A pause. "Everything." She picked up her kit. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has spent years arriving at a specific place and has found it to be exactly what they calculated it would be. Not better, not worse, exactly what she calculated. "Thank you, sir," she said. She walked out into the corridor. Behind her, Bates sat at the table with his hands flat on its surface and the cold light of an early desert morning beginning to come through the single window, gray and honest, and without mercy for what it illuminated. He sat there for 11 minutes. Then he stood and went to find a secure terminal. Midscript CTA. If you want to see how Maya's mission changes everything and what her father's file actually contains, subscribe to Seal Legends and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Every story on this channel is about the people history forgot to mention. I want to make sure you don't miss a single one. 6 weeks later, in a room at a Carolina installation that smelled of new paint and the specific optimism of a space recently converted from storage to purpose, Maya Chen stood at the front of 14 chairs. 11 of them were occupied by people who had heard specific things about her and were watching to see whether the things were true. The other 3 would be filled the following Monday when the second cohort confirmation came through. The program was called Advanced Combat Medical Integration. It convened at 700 on Mondays and Wednesdays. Bates had submitted the formal statement 11 days after the operation. It had traveled through a legal intermediary to a Senate Oversight Committee and had been placed into a protected record in a location where it could not be conveniently reclassified or made to disappear by someone with the clearance to do so. The documentation around Stonegate would possibly never be public. But it existed. The people who needed to know it existed had been informed. The arithmetic of risk that governed decisions about inconvenient survivors had shifted in the direction that made a certain man's continued existence the administratively simpler option for everyone with a stake in the matter. He was in Montana now. He had been in Montana for 2 weeks. He was learning the specific rhythms of a life that was no longer required to be invisible, which turned out to require its own kind of adjustment, because 10 years of invisibility had become its own form of habit, and habits do not end on the day the circumstances that created them do. He was patient. He had always been patient. He was learning to apply it differently. Maya had driven to Montana 3 weeks ago. She had not flown because the drive was something she had needed. The accumulation of miles, the way the country opened past the Missouri River and did not close again until the mountains began, the specific quality of space that cannot be compressed into a flight without losing something that matters. She had driven with the window down past the point where the cold made that sensible, because the cold was not the point. The house was small and solid, and exactly what it looked like, a life being lived quietly on its own terms, without apology, by someone who had spent 10 years earning the right to quiet. A woodpile against the east wall stacked with the precision of someone who understood that preparation is not pessimism. A kitchen garden put to bed for winter by someone who intended to plant it again in spring. Her mother had been on the porch. They had spoken 2 months before that, 3 hours covering 4 years, with the imperfect, genuine effort of 2 people who loved each other and had been carrying grief in separate rooms and were ready now to try carrying it in the same one. The door had opened. Thomas, Master Chief David Chen, living now under a different name in a different county, in a state that did not appear in any file that bore his original name, had been 54 years old. His hair was entirely gray in a way that hair goes when a man has spent 10 years carrying the weight of sustained absence and the daily discipline of not existing. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been holding in his mind as a fixed point for a very long time, and is now confronted with the reality, which is both more and less than the image, and neither more nor less than enough. She had walked toward him across the frozen ground. There were no words that needed to happen first. There is a silence between people separated by years and circumstances they did not choose who are standing in the same physical space for the first time. It is the fullest silence there is, more articulate than anything language can hold, requiring nothing from either person except the willingness to stand in it without rushing toward the other side. They had stood in it. Her mother had stopped pretending not to watch. After a long time, he had put one hand on the side of her face and said nothing, and she had said nothing, and the Montana sky above them was the pale, enormous, honest color of a sky that has decided not to pretend about winter. Back in Carolina now, 6 weeks later, she looked at the 14 people in front of her. She recognized the specific quality of their attention, the assessment, the waiting, the particular doubt that belongs to people who have been in this kind of room before, and understand that most of the time the thing in front of them will not be what it presents as. She did not resent the doubt. She had earned the right to answer it. On the board behind her, in her handwriting, understand the conditions, be the variable. She had not invented those words. They had been given to her in an empty field by a patient man who had understood that the most important things could not be transmitted directly, but had to be placed in someone and allowed to become theirs over time. She had been carrying them for 17 years. They were hers now in the way that true things eventually become yours, not because you claimed them, but because you proved them. The most common failure in combat medicine, she said, is the gap between what we check and what we see. Nobody spoke. The room had the quality of attention that belongs to people who understand the sentence has not finished. 6 weeks ago, A primary SARC cleared a team member with a residual posterior rotator cuff tear for a primary element assault in mountain terrain. The clearance was correct within the limits of the protocol he was following. The protocol was incomplete for the specific conditions of that mission. The gap between those two things came within 40% of compromising the entire operation. She looked at the room. This program exists to close that gap. She set her notebook on the table. You will learn to see what is present, not what the protocol tells you should be present. You will learn to assess under conditions that do not permit assessment to be clean or sequential or comfortable. You will learn to do two things simultaneously, because the nature of the work requires it, and the people who cannot do it will not be asked to do it a second time. A pause. The people who can do it will be asked until they can't be. That is the character of the work. It does not change. What changes is the quality of the preparation. 14 notebooks opened. The Monday session had begun. Outside, the Carolina sun moved through its normal arc. The installation went about its ordinary work. Somewhere to the northwest, Bates was in a building preparing for a briefing that would require him to explain to a room full of senior officers why his roster had been rearranged mid-mission and what had happened to the 943-meter shot. He had been preparing this explanation for 6 weeks. He had not found a version of it that was entirely comfortable. He had concluded that comfort was not available, and that the absence of comfort was appropriate, and that he could say everything he needed to say without it. Wren sent her a message on a Tuesday at 2300. 4 sentences, no subject line. I have been in this work for 22 years. I have met 3 people whose hands told me something before they said a word. I am saying this now because not saying it seemed like the wrong choice, and I have made enough wrong choices to have developed a preference. You are the best I have seen. She read it twice. She did not respond. The correct answer to honesty, offered freely by someone who offers it, rarely is to receive it without diminishing it, and silence was the most respectful form of receipt she had. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the Carolina morning doing what mornings do, assembling itself without ceremony, without the fanfare the moment might have seemed to deserve, just the next morning in a sequence of mornings that would continue until they didn't. The frost on the grass, the tree line at the edge of the base holding the first light at an angle that would shift in 20 minutes and be different tomorrow. She thought about her father in Montana, learning the rhythms of visible life after 10 years of invisible life. She thought about the 14 people in the chairs on Monday and Wednesday mornings, and what they were learning and what they would do with it. She thought about Wren's message at 2300 and the quality of attention it described. She put the coffee down. She opened her notebook. She had work to do. Outside, the frost held the light for exactly as long as it was able. Then, the sun moved on, and the morning went forward into whatever it was going to be. And Maya Chen, who had spent 17 years understanding the conditions and being the last variable, was already preparing for the next one. End script CTA. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Seal Legends. We have more stories about the people who were never in the official report. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a room where someone decided what you were before you said a word?